Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Dana Barton.
Hey everyone! Welcome back to Adventures in Accessibility. Today's guest is Yomi Wrong. Yomi is a Northern California-based leader in the field of healthcare and disability access. She's the former executive director of the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, California. In addition to advocating for equal access in healthcare, she writes the All Systems Go column on disability and travel for the Los Angeles Times, drawing on her previous career as a daily news reporter. Welcome, Yomi. It's so great to have you on Adventures in Accessibility today. We're really pleased that you were able to join us.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So let's start. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your disability?
Okay. Well, I am, oh my gosh, how old am I? 47 years old. I have to think about that one sometimes. And I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I have Osteogenesis Imperfecta, also known as brittle bone disease.
Okay. And you were born with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Disabled since birth. Since before birth, actually, in utero.
Oh, really? It starts in utero?
It does.
Okay. And so tell us about, being a child growing up with this disability.
Well, osteogenesis imperfecta is really characterized by, I would say, two profound things. One is that our bones break easily. So we have softer bones. So I actually fractured in utero. I was born with broken bones, and my childhood, I had a lot of broken bones, a lot of surgeries to strengthen my bones, rottings, and that sort of thing. So that was sort of one aspect of my childhood and growing up with my disability. The other characteristic for most people with OI is that we are short-statured, so we are little people. And I consider myself part of the LP community as well. Okay.
And tell us about how does it affect you now?
That's a difficult question only because I've always had my disability. I think it's a very different experience when you are born with a disability than somebody that acquires a disability at some point in life, because they have this experience of, being able-bodied, whatever that means, and not having this disability to suddenly having it. So I have always had my disability. I've always been part of the disability community. I've always had to navigate spaces as a disabled person. And so, obviously there are challenges to just navigating the built environment, navigating systems, school systems, employment systems as a person with a disability. So it's sort of hard for me to say, how does that affect me as an adult? Because I've grown up with my disability. I've grown with my disability. I can say that my attitude toward sort of my position in life and how I move through the world as an adult, a disabled adult, has shifted. I didn't always have a particularly, I would say, positive perspective about being disabled. I didn't really grow up with a lot of positive influences and role models of people who were disabled. So I really had to, by trial and error, I'd say, develop a healthy sense of self.
And do you think that lack of positive role models or positive influences is due to a lack of images of individuals with disabilities in mainstream media? Is that part of it?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, media shapes culture, and it always has. And when you don't see images of yourself reflected on television, in movies, in any part of media that our culture is consuming, it's the same with positive images of race or positive images of your gender or any part of your identity. You're kind of symbolically annihilated from the culture. And that's really how I felt growing up, never really seeing what I would consider normalized images of people with disabilities. When people with disabilities are represented in media, particularly during my upbringing, they were always extremes, either objects of pity or just like these superhuman caricatures, really.
Right.
And it was a very, it's just weird. So, like, there was nothing that I could really relate to because I definitely didn't pity myself. I understood that the larger culture probably viewed me as an object of pity, but, that's a bummer, so I don't want to identify with that.
Sure.
And then, and I'm also not superhuman, like this whole, characterization of people with disabilities as objects of inspiration.
Right.
And somehow, superhuman just for doing everyday things. I mean, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir because I know that, people that maybe your audience will understand this phenomenon of inspiration porn. But when you have a very apparent and obvious disability, and especially one that affects physical characteristics such as my stature, it's really pervasive that people will either fetishize that or focus on your physicality. And so that's always been something that I've had to deal with.
So, Yomi, the ADA was passed after you were a child. Were you in high school or college?
Yeah, so the ADA became law in 1990. I graduated high school in 1990. There were certainly, laws on the books prior to the ADA. We had Section 504, the Rehab Act. We had other state and federal laws that pertained to my rights as a person with a disability, but there was nothing as, I would say, paradigm shifting as the ADA. So
did you, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really envy the generation behind me because there are people like, I call them the ADA babies, right? So they sort of grew up in this era after we had this really important civil rights law. And it's not to say that everything is perfect. We still, I think, have a long way to go to really realize the promise and really the social contract that is kind of embedded in the ADA. But, I didn't have that growing up. There was a lot of tension for my family around my rights and advocating for me to be in public spaces, in public school systems. So, I'm thankful for the ADA, but it didn't really start to impact my life until I could say maybe a decade after I graduated high school.
Really? So it took nearly 10 years for you to see some of these changes?
Any legislation, just because it's signed doesn't mean that it's implemented, right? So it doesn't mean that it's infused in all of the areas of society that it needs to be. It takes time to sort of get baked into our democratic system, if you will. So the law is passed in 1990, but I don't believe that I even started to really understand some of its promises and effects until much, much later.
What do you think caused you, or what was the catalyst in you seeing those changes or realizing those effects?
When I entered the world of work is when I started hearing more about the ADA. It was certainly present in the employment process. I started noticing more language around disability rights and inclusion in the application process and in all of that sort of HR function. Mm-hmm. And then, but I didn't really develop a lot of sort of language around this civil rights law until I started getting involved in the independent living movement. So it's almost embarrassing to say that, right? Like you're a disabled person, but you really don't understand what this law means to you. And that's just real. I really didn't understand it. I didn't know how to utilize it as a tool to my own sort of liberation and advancement in society until I really needed it, right? Until I started facing really systemic, obvious oppression and discrimination. And then it was like, okay, I have this civil rights law to fall back on, to draw from. And when I joined the independent living movement and started meeting and working with other disabled folks, that's when I learned to really be able to be effective in kind of using the law, not just to my advantage, but to really advance the independence and liberation of all disabled people.
So you were the executive director for the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley.
Yes.
Did you start in a different role there and move into that position, or were you hired directly as the executive director?
No, I started as a board member, and I never dreamed or intended to actually work for the organization. At the time that I joined CIL's board, I was actually a working journalist. I was writing for a daily newspaper, and I was on the board for several years. I think I was in my second or third term as a board member. I had become board chair at that point. And then my newspaper career ended. I took a buyout, and I was freelance writing and editing, and just, trying to figure out what I was going to do next with my writing career and my journalism career. And there was a leadership change at CIL. And it was kind of an emergency situation. And we, all of the board members, we kind of looked around the room and said, okay, is there anybody that could maybe go into work for a few weeks in the organization just to kind of keep it together? Because we had a big gap in leadership at the time. And I was the one with the most flexible work schedule. And right. So I got tapped to go into work there. And it was really supposed to be for just a few weeks. And a few weeks turned into a few months. And then I was interim. And then anybody who runs a nonprofit, that interim status for the top position in an organization is really not sustainable. Funders like to see stability. But we weren't ready at that time to do a search for a new executive director. And so I took the job permanently, but really as a stopgap until we could kind of rework the organization. At that time, CIL was embarking on a big physical move to the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, which is a universally designed disability nonprofit center, and we had other disability organizations that were our partners. So all of this converged at once, and we really needed somebody to go in and be the director and kind of keep the ship moving and steer it in the right direction. And so I did that job for about 5 years, and then I moved on, and CIL did a national search for its more permanent director.
Sure. What was your experience in, if you needed accommodations in that position and then future subsequent positions?
So I say independent living centers are a great place to work and to grow and to hone skills. But they also are kind of like another world. They're not really like the real world of work in this sense. At least at CIL in Berkeley. Like accommodations are just a no-brainer.
Right.
You get accommodated, at least for us and our staff. It didn't become this kind of source of angst around the interactive process or, any of that.
Sure.
So in a way, and because we were at the Ed Roberts campus, which is this wonderful, accessible work environment, it doesn't necessarily approximate what I would call the private sector or the other world of work.
Right.
And so I worked in the private sector from up until that point. And working in the private sector is like a whole different animal, especially when you're in a big corporate kind of structure. I was writing for newspapers, and I had always worked for large media companies. I worked for a company called Gannett. That was my first newspaper job. I worked for Freedom Communications. So I was writing for the Orange County Register. And then I worked for Gannett again. And then I worked for a company called Knight Ridder. And that was when I was writing for the San Jose Mercury News. So these are big media companies, big conglomerates. So you're really in kind of a corporate structure. And I remember it was, and I was building my career at the time. I was really dedicated to journalism. I was dedicated to journalism and really helping to shape the community I serve through doing good journalism. When you're young and you're a reporter or editor and you're just starting out, you go from smaller papers to mid-size to big. You move around a lot as you're building your career and your portfolio. And, you want to go where the good jobs are.
Right.
And I remember I was working at a newspaper while I was in college. And that's how I got into newspaper work. I didn't intend on going into journalism, but I needed a job in college, and the local newspaper was hiring. news assistant, and so I got a job as a news assistant to help pay my way through college. And then I got bit by the bug, and I became very committed to journalism and news writing and storytelling. And when I was trying to find my first full-time job, I was about to, leave college, and I needed to find my first full-time reporting job. I applied for jobs all over the country, wherever I saw an opening that looked kind of interesting. And I applied for a job, I believe the paper was in Alabama.
Okay.
And I sent my clips. So clips are samples of your work. I sent, my resume, my clips, everything to the editor/publisher. It was a very small paper, so they had a combined executive editor and publisher. And we had a phone interview. And at the conclusion of the interview, he asked me to send a photo.
What?
Because he wanted to see what I looked like.
Wow.
Right. And I was like, that's actionable. That's wrong on so many levels.
So many levels. Holy
And
moly.
so I should also say, I have multiple identities, right? And so I am an African-American woman. I'm a little person. So I have this disability. I move through the world as a woman of color who's disabled. And I just felt like I was probably going to check a lot of boxes for this guy that he didn't want to deal with. I just felt like I felt like it was illegal and potentially discriminatory for him to ask, for him to need to see what I look like before he made a job offer.
Absolutely. Did you send the picture?
I did not send the picture.
Did you get the job?
I did not get the job.
Wow.
I just refused to send the picture, and so he just stopped talking to me. I think he ghosted me or something. I think he just we stopped communicating. And so that was the first thing. And then an editor that I had worked with in college got the top job at a small newspaper in Salinas, California. Mm-hmm. And so I applied for an opening there, and I got the job. And I was really excited to have this job. And I was going to be covering education. And the Salinas Valley is known for agriculture, and so we had a big migrant community, and I was super excited and fascinated and passionate about writing not just about K through 12 education, but the impact on migrant families and children from migrant families. And so this was, at that point, like the best job for me. And so I accepted the job, and I started, but initially, so the newsroom was on the second floor of the building. And the first floor was marketing and other services, but all of the reporters and editors were upstairs, and they only had a freight elevator. And so for my first year or so at that job, I did not sit with my colleagues. I sat downstairs at a desk. Okay. I think in maybe the marketing or advertising department, perfectly nice people, but I wasn't part of the team.
How did that affect your career?
It didn't necessarily hold me back in that role because I had worked with this editor previously, and she was very supportive of me and growing my career, and she was actually became a mentor to me. And so she and another editor that I actually reported to directly, I didn't report to her directly, I reported to somebody else. They did everything they could to try to make it work and make me feel comfortable. But when you're not sitting with your colleagues, you miss a lot. I missed out on all of the conversations and the collegiality, and it was really difficult, and it was isolating, but I really needed that job. I wanted that job. I needed the experience. I was young, and I was building my career, but it sucked.
Did you, say this isn't right and I need to be upstairs?
I did. It was an older building, and there were concerns about, no passengers in the freight elevator. And eventually we worked around that, and I moved upstairs. I don't know, on whose authority I was finally able to use the freight elevator. I would use the elevator for certain things, to go upstairs, for meetings or something like that. But there's all the water cooler conversation and all of the team building that happens sort of in between the work, and an environment like a newsroom, sort of you need to be with your colleagues. And that was really, really difficult. And I considered leaving for that reason. And then somehow we worked around it. I don't remember the sequence of events, but I did push. And I did say, I need to be upstairs. And so I started using the freight elevator. And I think the operational solution we came with was that somebody needed to ride the elevator with me, because I really couldn't operate the elevator on my own. That was the other issue. It was kind of an old style freight elevator with a gate that you had to pull shut. Exactly. And so, that's hard. And then I eventually moved upstairs. Like every time I needed to leave, I needed somebody to help me with that elevator.
Wow.
And that wasn't the first time. I mean, ever since I started working, there have been these issues around physical accommodations. One of my, we've all had horror stories of like your best and worst job. So in college, right, a rite of passage is to have these horrible jobs in college, right? So before I started working for the newspaper, I had a job one summer. It was horrible. I worked for Sears, and my job was to sell maintenance agreements. So I don't know if you've ever bought an appliance at Sears, but they always try to sell you on these maintenance agreements.
Sure, like an extended warranty or something?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And so the group that, and I was part of a group, right? We were all hired, and it was a bunch of college kids and stuff. And a girlfriend of mine and I, we both got this job. It was a summer job, and it paid really well. And we were in kind of like this dark, like basement call center where we had to just basically be on. It was telemarketing, and we had to just be on the phone all the time, selling maintenance agreements, asking people to re-up their maintenance agreements. And so we were all like suffering together, trying to meet these call quotas. But here's the thing. The building where we worked, there was not an accessible restroom that I could use.
Okay.
The restroom, and we were at like a service center. The accessible restroom was at the mall at the Sears store, which was across like a 4-lane expressway.
What?
So I couldn't use the bathroom. If I needed to use the bathroom at all, I had to cross a highway.
Wow.
Like a lot of people with disabilities, right? This is like part of our story, part of our culture. Like you learn how to like not have to pee. I didn't drink or eat during my shift. I didn't go to lunch with my coworkers because I couldn't go to the bathroom. In order for me to go to the bathroom, I had to play Frogger across this expressway, and if I only had a 15-minute break, and they said that they would have accommodated and given me a little bit more time, but like really it was super awkward and inconvenient.
Did they ever change that or change the location?
They never changed that. I kept the job for the summer, and then I quit because then school started again, and I was glad to be done with the job, but like I needed a paycheck. And these are the things that really, and that's probably not even the worst of it. I have friends that, just the stuff we suffer through just to get a job, right? Just to be able to feed ourselves. There is this predominant ableist view that because we're disabled, like the government takes care of us. And that's just not true for many of us. So many of us want and need to work. And it's just really, really hard. These, like I should be able to go to the bathroom, on my break.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
But I wasn't able to do that, but I needed that job. And so I just quit that job. And then later that year is when I found the job at the local newspaper, and I was able to use the bathroom and, and all of that. But, it's tough. It has not been easy.
Had you intended when you started college to go into journalism? I know you said you kind of fell into it.
No, I didn't intend that. I really didn't know what I wanted to be. I did not benefit from any kind of like career counseling in high school. I think there were counselors at my high school. None of them ever talked to me. I think one of them, I made an appointment and talked to somebody when I was applying for college. I didn't know what I wanted to be. When people talked to me about career options, it was like, oh, maybe you could be a social worker or a school teacher, something where, you could just sort of sit down all the time. My dream when I was a child was actually to go into medicine. I really, really, really wanted to be a doctor. Okay. And I was discouraged from that because a lot of people that I talked to, my own doctors, they said, I think it's going to be really difficult for you. And so I just never pursued it. I wish that I had. When I got into college, I didn't know what I wanted to be, and I don't think that made me very different from a lot of freshmen going in.
Yeah.
somebody, some people said, well, maybe you should go into computer sciences. Like, I think my dad wanted me to declare myself as a computer science major. I should have listened to him. I should have gone into tech. I'd be a lot richer by now. But I wasn't interested. And so I just declared some major. I don't know what. Maybe I was undeclared at first. And then I decided I took some communication classes and also some sociology classes, and I got interested in communications. I declared myself a mass communication major, and I thought that I was going to be a media broker. So I was sort of on a track of going into the business side of media companies, so like buying and selling media companies. That's what I thought I was going to do. And I went to the Career Center one day. I worked on campus as well. I had an on-campus job and at the Career Center, and I saw a flyer for the local Gannett newspaper needed a business news assistant. And so I applied for the job. It was 30 hours a week, and it paid more than my on-campus work-study job. Wow. So I applied, I got the job, and I started working in a newsroom, and I fell in love with the profession, and that's how I stayed. Well, and I did that for a long time.
Well, we originally met because of a column that you were writing for the LA Times. So you're still writing a column for the LA Times, is that right?
Yeah, my column is, it's my little baby. It's, I guess it would be a year old now. So the editor that I mentioned to you became my mentor and really helped develop my journalism career, and she's become one of my very best friends. She worked at the paper that I was hired at in college, but I didn't work directly for her. She worked at the paper in Salinas, and then she left and went to the Los Angeles Times, and so we stayed connected on a personal level for many years, and she really helped kind of guide me from afar and coach me and mentor me through my journalism career. And then I left journalism in 2007. I left the newsroom. I put writing and editing and everything behind me when I went to work at the Center for Independent Living. That took me on a very different trajectory, and I now work full-time as an ADA compliance manager in a healthcare organization. So I'm on like my second career. And about 18 months ago, this editor, her name is Catherine Ham. She's the travel editor for the LA Times. Like I said, we'd always kept in touch, and our families would sometimes travel together and vacation together. We'd become good friends and almost like extended family. She asked me if I would be interested in writing a column about disability and travel. I think she framed it as mobility and travel, because she was sometimes getting questions and feedback from readers about having issues about, traveling with a disability. And I was like, wow, could I do this? And I thought about it, and I said, well, yeah. She said, well, we can just try it. We can pilot it, see what kind of reaction we get. And so we launched this column together called All Systems Go. And it's a monthly column. It's just, 750 words max. And I write about different topics. It takes a lot of focus and time. And sometimes I kick myself, like, what have I gotten myself into? Because, it takes time to really research and report a topic. And I don't feel like I always have the time. I feel stretched, very thin. But it's kind of a passion of mine. I like to travel. I believe strongly that people with disabilities should get out in the world. And so the column is really focused on how do you make trips work? What are some workarounds? What are some solutions to some of the challenges that people with all types of disabilities may be confronted with when they travel? So she asked me to do the column. I agreed. I've been doing it now for a little over a year, and I'm not, I don't think I've perfected it because I just don't have a lot of time to dedicate to it, but it's getting some good traction, and I think the Times is happy with it, and so, I'll stick with it for a while.
That's really neat. Given your own experiences traveling and what you've learned through this column, what does equal access look like for people with disabilities when they travel?
I'll give an example because I travel a lot for work a couple of times a year. And also just, my partner and I travel for vacations when we can afford it. And so I'll just give one example. The primary mode of transportation for me is air. Is air travel. And so, I joke, but it's a half joke. I say, if I ever want to experience what it's like to be a second-class citizen, I'll catch any domestic flight anywhere in the United States, because it's really a crapshoot in terms of the service and treatment on any commercial airline. Everything from, how they treat our equipment or devices, which is poorly, to, just the whole experience. I think air travel has become kind of like this nightmare for all Americans. It's just difficult. It's not what I remember as a kid. Like getting on a plane used to be this great experience. We got dressed up for it. They served you a meal. It just felt like this really great thing. Now it's horrible. You don't get anything. You're crammed in there. And so we're all kind of suffering together. But when you have a disability and you're traveling, I just don't feel like the industry is really set up to meet our needs. And equal access, I think, for people with disabilities means that you can sort of travel kind of as easily or seamlessly or as independently as everybody else. And, for me, one of my biggest issues is being able to have a functioning mobility device when I get to my destination. And I would say 70% of the time, my wheelchair is returned to me broken. And it's not unique. This is kind of a universal experience for any traveler that uses a mobility device. That's really kind of a pain point. The other issue, equal access in airfare or in air travel for me, would be being able to use the onboard lavatory.
Oh, sure.
I do this whole, I play like this Russian roulette with my bladder. I try not to drink. 8 hours before my flight. I try to go to the bathroom right before I board because I know that it's really not accessible. Like 2 times in my life, I've had no choice, and I had to use the aisle chair to use the bathroom. This is when I'm traveling alone. If I travel with my partner, he will get me to the bathroom or, a family member. But if I'm traveling alone, which I often do for work, I have to ask the flight attendants to assist me. So awkward.
Right.
So I have to get in an aisle chair. The aisle chairs do not fit in the lavatory. So once they push me in there, I can't close the door. So I have to do my business with the door open. It's just awful. So I would say that qualifies as a failure of equal access.
Sure. And certainly always an adventure.
Always.
When you're traveling. Yeah. Yeah. Well, to wrap up today, Yomi, I'm hoping that you can share for us maybe some advice you have for other individuals with disabilities as they work to develop their own strong identities like you have.
Okay. Well, the first thing I would say is try to develop or, engage in sort of a peer group. Being in community, having intimate friendships, having working relationships, having social relationships with other disabled folks has really opened up my life. I am, in my immediate family, the only person with a physical disability. And so while my family and close circle of friends and family, they may not have a disability, they're obviously allies and very supportive of me, but nobody really understands how you move through the world and some of the issues that you face like another disabled person. And so I would say developing peer relationships is huge. And I didn't have that opportunity as a child growing up, and so I seek it out as an adult because those are important relationships, to be able to support one another and learn from one another, to be able to not just vent, but, sort of figure stuff out together, to sort of laugh at circumstances, to have a sense of humor and levity around some of the issues that we face. When you are in community with people with disabilities, you become part of disability culture. You develop a sense of pride. You develop a strong sense of, I deserve to take up space in the world. And that is a really important liberatory mindset for you to have as a disabled person because our culture is so ableist. that there are so many places and experiences that will counter that will tell you that you should apologize or be ashamed for taking up space in the world, for needing accommodations, for sort of wanting to go where everybody else can go, to be able to live and work and play where you choose, that you really need to develop that healthy sense of pride and kind of that righteous attitude that, no, I deserve to be here too.
That's awesome. How can our listeners get in touch with you if they want to follow up with you after this recording?
I do have a public Facebook page. I have a private one that's just for my family and friends. Sure. And then I have one where I connect to my friends in the community, and it's just Yomi Wrong at Facebook. And there's a picture of me on there, so I'm easy to find. Awesome. I don't really tweet. I'm not very, very good at it, so Twitter is not a great place to connect with me. I do have a Twitter account, but I'm not very...
We won't tweet you.
Please don't tweet. I'm not very good at it. But, I accept Facebook friends, and I love to connect with people.
Awesome. Yomi, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share your story and your experiences with us and also our listeners.
Thank you so much for having me. Best of luck with the podcast.
We really hope that you're enjoying Adventures in Accessibility. Make sure that you've subscribed to us anywhere you listen to your podcasts. Also, be sure to rate us 5 stars.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Dana Barton, produced by Emily Schumann, and Mike Shea is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Grant number 90DP0094-01-00. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.